Hello everyone, and welcome to our podcast series in the classical political economy tradition by the Vinson Center for the Public Understanding of Economics and Entrepreneurship at the University of Buckingham. The Vinson Center runs a series of programs in economics and related fields designed to promote a wider understanding of classical liberal economics and how markets, trade, and entrepreneurship promote welfare in a free society. I'm Juan Castañeda, Director of the Vinson Center, and today we'll be hosting Johan Norberg. Johan Norberg is an author, lecturer, and documentary filmmaker born in Sweden. He received his MA in the History of Ideas from the University of Stockholm and is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. Norberg has written books on a broad range of topics, including global economics and popular science. He has achieved a worldwide readership with books like Progress and Open, translated into more than 30 languages. His most recent book is The Capitalist Manifesto, a book of the year in the Financial Times, and, according to Elon Musk, an excellent explanation of why capitalism is not just successful, but morally right. For his work, Norberg has received several awards, including the distinguished Sir Anthony Fisher Memorial Award from the Atlas Foundation, the Walter Judd Freedom Award, and the Gold Medal from the German Hayek Stiftung. Today, we'll discuss the Capitalist Manifesto with his author, Johan Norberg. Johan, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Your latest book, The Capitalist Manifesto, is an apologetic defense of capitalism, quite a rarity these days. Referring to one of the quotes used in your book, what has savage capitalism done for us?
Yeah, capitalism is sometimes called savage capitalism by its critics, and especially they're talking about the period after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when we got global capitalism, more free trade and more freedom, more economic freedom than we've had, at least in the recent past. And what has it done since? Well, it hasn't been that savage, because if we're looking at the scourges, the biggest problems of mankind, well, never before have they declined as much as they've done in the years after 1990. So if you're looking at illiteracy, child mortality, and hunger, they were all reduced by some 40 to 50% during this era, and extreme poverty even more. Around 130,000 people have been lifted out of extreme poverty every day over these past 30 years. Despite all the problems we've had, despite the pandemic, wars, global financial crises, we've had the greatest improvement in human living standards ever. And it happened in the places that began to open up, integrate into global markets, began to give their citizens more freedom to produce, to innovate, and to trade. So that's what savage capitalism has done. It has saved us from some of the worst ancient problems we've always suffered through.
Well, that's quite extraordinary. And is this something capitalism does in any case, or are there certain conditions under which markets and capitalism enhance welfare?
Well, there are some things that we certainly need. We need rule of law, protection of property rights, and free exchange. But this whole discussion, whether we need specific conditions, specific relationships, extent of information, and so on markets, I think that's incredibly exaggerated. We always live in a world of limited information, of asymmetric power relationships. That doesn't matter. What matters is, how do we attain more information? How do we get more power in the market? And we do that through voluntary exchange, by being able to have a condition where no deal ever happens unless both parties think that it benefits them. Sometimes there will be big businesses out there, but as long as there are potential competition from others, they can only stay big if they continue to do research and innovation and constantly come up with a better offer to others. Even in instances like big tech, when we're talking about, there are certain things that they can exploit, the advantage of having these network effects. Nobody wants to be on social media where it's just you and me. We need more people out there. Well, then we should exploit those network effects by making sure that we have businesses entering those markets and exploiting them. As long as there is competition, or at least potential competition from outsiders, it is a good thing if they manage to use those opportunities.
So it is open markets what matters.
Open markets, which makes it possible for us to always turn elsewhere. And even if we don't see competitors on the market, there's always the potential of competition. If someone becomes lazy and stops giving us the best offers and producing something that's better, cheaper, or faster tomorrow than today, well, then someone else can enter the market. If that's there, if we have those open markets, it's a good thing.
Your book is very Hayekian. There is a whole chapter devoted to the power of markets as coordinators of millions of people's plans, something no individual or central planner could do. And yet we hear from time to time voices that claim that, for example, a central planner, a policymaker, a politician will be able to allocate resources better than the market. What are they missing in this with these arguments?
I'm glad you noticed. It is a very Hayekian book. I'm very inspired by his insights into human knowledge and how it's impossible to centralize it, and that we should leave decisions to the experts. And the experts are millions and millions of people looking at the world from their vantage point. So to me, economic freedom is really a system built on Socratic wisdom. Socrates' idea that being wise is to know what you don't know. We do not know the best way of organizing a business or insurances or the best social security system. So the only way to find out is to have lots of experiments and millions of people constantly trying to come up with something that's better. However, very few philosophers but Socrates knew what he didn't know. We more often have philosophers like Plato who think that they can organize society from the top. And I think that's because this Hayekian insight that truth is out there. We will never find it perfect and whole. It is always a process. A discovery process with millions of people involved. It's very counterintuitive. It's very difficult to understand how we can come up with better institutions and more wealth and solutions to our problems by not pointing in a certain direction, but by allowing this process to go on. I think we have this intuitive sense in human nature that if it's a big problem, we need a big solution to this problem. And I think that's something that has always been haunting ideologies and political systems throughout the ages. That temptation, sometimes it's power, hunger as well. Someone just wants to be in charge, but oftentimes I just think we are looking for something, someone to tell us the solution to our problems, especially when we're lost and we're afraid and the world is changing in unpredictable ways. We need this sort of the strong man or the big government to protect us. But the Hayekian wisdom is to say that especially when we don't know, when we're at a loss, when the world is changing in unpredictable ways, that's precisely the moment in time that we need to exploit more knowledge from more people who are more directly in touch with how the world is changing, how prices are changing, how access to opportunities are changing. So it's a difficult battle because it's partly fought with our own human instincts.
And that's precisely what markets provide, that knowledge, that decentralized knowledge you are referring to, because quite often in times of a severe crisis, we tend to reassure ourselves by appointing a group of experts, a committee. They will sort it out for us, right? That's quite it's very intuitive to do it, but it's never the right solution.
Exactly. It's always wrong because you can't centralize all that information. You can never see it perfect and whole, but you can feel it through the effects of what other people do if they are free to experiment and move to the places in the economy where they think they can do the best things. We can do that through the price system because the price system constantly informs us about the important things about where is there a shortage, where can my services be of more importance to others than elsewhere? So that's why we should certainly always try to avoid interfering in the market and cut those sources of information short with price controls and heavy intervention.
Let's discuss now free trade. One of the things most economists seem to agree with is that trade benefits both parties. That's why they engage in trade in the first place. Why then not many, not even those who claim to be supporters of free markets, advocate for unilateral free trade, regardless of what other economists do?
That's a great question. And I think it's really related to a lack of imagination. It's so easy for us to start with the status quo and just change it slightly, slowly. And then we have this misunderstanding of trade that lots of people assume that it's good to export lots of things because we get money in exchange, but it's difficult to import because sort of we lose this wealth. But obviously, we cannot. We can only eat imports. We cannot eat exports. I mean, in fact, the only reason to engage in trade is to get something in exchange for our exports. We all understand that intuitively in our work life, I think. Most of us would like to export a little less, sort of work a little bit less, and be able to buy a bit more. So obviously it's a good thing, both imports and exports. But I think with that, if you have that mindset, if you buy into that myth somewhat, that it's a kind of a sacrifice to open up to imports from other places, then it makes sense to keep those trade barriers until the other guy reduces their trade barriers. But obviously, it's the same mistake as in the story when you throw stones and rocks into your own harbor just because the neighboring country has very rocky coastline, so it's difficult for your ships to enter and sell your goods. It's a good thing to be open to all those to those goods and services, and that's why unilateral free trade is a good idea. But I think sometimes we just get stuck in trade negotiations and think that it's about give and take between different sorts of trade barriers, while we have to understand that all forms of trade barriers is actually a way of hurting ourselves.
And of course, is the power of interest groups. They play a role in this as well, do you think?
For sure. The reason why we have these trade negotiations is that there are lots of local producers and monopolists who don't want cheaper and better goods from other places. So sometimes the only way to create a bigger set of interest groups locally in favor of free trade is to get the exporters to join in and understand that, look, if we lower our trade barriers, they will lower theirs. And in that case, we might have a strong group collection of interest groups, which in total then neglects the powers of the local monopolistic interest groups. But what this all neglects is that the most important groups are the individuals and the local producers and consumers, the individuals going to work every day. And they all benefit from both cheaper goods from other places and from the constant upgrading of productivity that you get when you're exposed to competition. But obviously, that goes back to the ancient problem that the cost of protection is dispersed among the whole population, and it's very difficult for them to organized in a pressure group, whereas it's very easy for the few producers who would lose from free trade to hire a lobbyist and then go into the government offices and talk about these things. So that blocks many of the reforms that would benefit most of us.
Well, Johan, markets are not just efficient means to allocate resources. That's clear that they are, but it's not just that. I mean, you also make the moral case for capitalism in your book. Can you elaborate on this, please?
Yes, to me, this is very important, and it's even more important than the practical consequences of having more economic freedom. The fact that freedom treats us as human beings with dignity, who are not, shouldn't be forced into certain conditions and certain deals without our say. And that's an amazing thing. It's the first economic system in history which gives us this form of dignity. In all previous systems, be it slavery or feudalism or communism or fascism, it's all about getting resources by taking them from others, by exploiting those who do the work. Free market capitalism is the first system where you are actually entitled to say, no, I don't agree with this, so I turn to an alternative option over here. You're not forced to enter any kind of deal unless you think it would be of benefit to yourself. And that's a good thing economically, of course, because then you will get, people will start working in your favor. They will have to take your needs into consideration if they want to become wealthy. But it also means that you're treated as a individual human being with your own value hierarchy of values, and you are allowed to pursue those rather than just being seen as the means for somebody else's goals. And this is something that I think that few people take into consideration because they forget what the alternative is about.
The combination of capitalism and globalization have resulted in something you've mentioned already, is the improvement of living standards worldwide, and poverty levels have actually declined significantly in the last 3 decades. And yet we usually hear actually is a very gloomy vision of the market economy, let alone capitalism. The facts seem to be on our side, if I can put it that way, but we seem to be losing the ideological battle.
I think we are. Right now, capitalism is in great shape if you look at what it produces, continues to produce progress, but it is in a bad shape in popular opinion. The traditional statist left constantly only thinks it's unjust, but now we also have it from a populist protectionist right, which complains about it as well. And I think one reason is that we've had a series of we've had times of trouble lately. We've had a pandemic, we've had wars, we've had endless chaos in the Middle East, and oftentimes in eras when we feel this insecurity, we want the big government to protect us. We think that it's very unreliable and dangerous with market forces and global supply chains and so on. And I understand where that temptation comes from. But if you look at what helps us to constantly innovate ourselves out of those problems, rebuilding supply chains during the pandemic, then doing it again after Putin invaded Ukraine, making sure that we didn't get those devastating shortages that everybody expected, which resulted in lower food prices adjusted for general inflation than we had before Putin's invasion of Ukraine. All those adjustments that keep on happening constantly, day by day, comes from the experts, the entrepreneurs, the workers, the consumers who face those price signals and constantly find a new way out of these problems and constantly saves us from those very real horrors that we also experience. So we have to count to 10 and not be overwhelmed by the problems of the world, but instead look at how we constantly innovate ourselves out of them. And then we see a wonderful example of why capitalism helps us.
Well, every chapter in your book has case studies, real life examples, and indeed plenty of evidence to support your points. I would very much recommend anyone interested in these topics, all the data and resources in the book notes, for example. Alongside with your book, which other readings or references would you recommend for those interested on how markets function?
I think there's such a great outpouring of books looking at different and studies looking at different aspects of how markets work. And so if I were to mention just one thing that instead gives you a perspective on the economy, that helps you make sense of all those studies and all of these events, it would actually be a 170-year-old essay from France by Frédéric Bastiat, the great economist, called What is Seen and What is Not Seen, where he by looking at just simple examples, he manages to explain a whole worldview of how the economy works, and it helps you make sense of what goes on in the world, but also it helps you to recognize nonsense when you hear it and false solutions to our problems.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you, Johan, very much for joining us today. Thank you all very much for listening, and enjoy reading the Capitalist Manifesto. Thank you all very much for listening. This podcast is edited by the Vinson Center at the University of Buckingham. You can visit our website at vinsoncentre.com to access our podcast series and know more about the programs and events we host, both in Buckingham and in London. Please subscribe to our newsletter if you want to receive timely information on the Vinson Centre's agenda.